Whenever we read, study, reflect upon stories from the Bible, and this is true of any story, books, movies, you name it, we often give a lot of attention to the plot of the story, the outworking of the events. The people were in Egypt, and then God came and delivered them, and then they went into the wilderness, and then they went to Mount Sinai, and so on and so forth, right? We also give a lot of attention to characters in the story. God, Moses, Pharaoh. What are these characters all about? What are their motivations? What are they thinking? What are they doing? And we kind of dive deep into these different explorations. And all of these questions and paths are valuable and insightful. But one thing, one aspect of stories that I think often does not get the attention that it deserves is the setting of the story, or settings of the story. And this is particularly true when it comes to interpreting and studying stories from the Old Testament, because the people who were writing and compiling and reading these stories in their original context, the ancient Israelites, were much more concerned about the land than we often are today. They were attuned with their own setting, as it were, their own environment. Think about all of the importance of the land that you hear about throughout the Old Testament. And so it would make sense that setting is a significant aspect of the stories that the Israelites would tell. And when we read stories, what we, I think, often would find if we pay attention to the settings is that the setting often adds a great deal of significance to our understanding of what the story is all about. And this is also true when it comes to Exodus. So for instance, have you ever asked yourself, as you've worked through the Exodus story, why were the Israelites in danger at times of experiencing the plagues themselves? Like, why did they have to take certain actions, certain precautions in order to protect themselves from the plagues, like wiping blood on the mantle and doorposts of their homes, right? Or maybe you've asked yourself the question, why Mount Horeb, or Mount Sinai, as it's often called in the Bible? What's so special about this particular place that the Bible is very explicit that it's only after Moses carried his flocks to the far side of the wilderness and came to Mount Sinai, or Mount Horeb, that's where God appeared to him in the burning bush. And it's only as the people get to Mount Sinai after they're out of Egypt that God reveals himself, and he has this great theophany of thunder and smoke and lightning, and he reveals himself to them there. Why there? Why couldn't he just do that in Egypt? Well, these are important questions, and I think helpful questions, and I think what they're all getting at and what they're all reflecting is that settings are very important in the book of Exodus. And in particular, what we seem to find as we read carefully through this book is that God acts in sometimes distinct and unique ways depending upon the setting at that particular point in time. So, for whatever reason, God reveals himself. He manifests himself in certain ways depending on the space or the place in which the people encounter him, right? So it's at Mount Sinai, which is kind of, we could call that like an in space, right? In which God invites people into his presence, and he reveals his presence to them. He reveals not just himself, but his instruction, his law, his will for Israel, and he initiates that covenant relationship with them there at Sinai. And so that's a place of revelation. It's a place of God's manifesting his presence. And it's an awesome place. It's a sometimes terrifying place, but it's a place where they worship him and they are encountered by God. That's contrasted, of course, very drastically and distinctively by Egypt. So if Sinai is kind of an in space, Egypt we might call an out space. It's not a manifestation of God's presence, but a manifestation of God's power. He acts very differently in Egypt. It's all about God demonstrating judgment, so that even if people are on pretty good terms with God, that does not necessarily preclude them from the potential of experiencing these acts of power, that they have to take certain actions, certain precautions while they are in this space, in this setting, because when God finds himself in an out space, God acts in a particular way. But in between Egypt and Sinai, between in spaces and out spaces, you also have this kind of fringe space, the space of the wilderness, the setting of the wilderness. And the wilderness, which takes place between chapters 15 and 19 or so of the book of Exodus, are all places in which there's kind of a liminal, fringe, uncomfortable thing going on. And all of the stories that take place in this setting all have to do with testing. Either Israel is testing God, or God is testing Israel, and Israel is uncomfortable. They don't know necessarily where they're going. They don't know how they're going to get food or water, and it's all related to this test of, will they trust that God will provide for their daily needs when they're in this setting or in this space? As I reflect upon these various settings in the book of Exodus, personally, I don't know about you, but for me, that really helps me sometimes make sense of the world around me, right? Because I can find myself as I journey through life inhabiting certain spaces of my own, in which it seems like my relationship with God seems to change, and it's nothing necessarily that I've done, but it's what God is doing. And it's helpful for me to remember that even though each of us have an individual relationship with God, that we have, our own kind of connection with God on a personal level, yet God is working on a much grander scale. And so there are going to be times in life where we journey into a kind of out space, where we find ourselves surrounded by demonstrations of God's power and even his judgment in the world around us. And we might ask ourselves, whoa, why am I in danger here? Why am I experiencing this? What have I done? And what the story of Exodus teaches us is that it's not necessarily about you or me as individuals. It's about what God is doing, how God is at work on a grander scale, that we are sometimes just going to find ourselves in a setting in which God is working in a particular way. And it's not about what we are doing or what we have done. It's about responding to God appropriately when we find ourselves in that place. It's important for us, for instance, if we find ourselves in kind of an out space, a space in which God is demonstrating judgment or power, to take the appropriate measures. That's a time that we can kind of double down and say, it's important for me to be diligent, that I'm following God's will, that I'm following his instructions for my life, lest I too find myself in danger of God's judgment. Now, there are other times where we are going to find ourselves in a setting in which we, for whatever reason, it seems like life is uncomfortable, and we are in this kind of wilderness space. We are in this fringe space in which we don't really know where we're headed. We don't really know where things are going to come from, how we're going to provide, and we need to know that sometimes God is going to test us. And we need to respond by remembering to trust in God's faithfulness. And finally, sometimes we're going to find ourselves in those in spaces. Those spaces where it seems like God's presence is almost palpable. It's tangible. We could reach out and touch God. Rejoice when you find yourselves in those spaces. And know that those are times for us to worship to listen to what God has to reveal to us, so that when we inevitably find ourselves walking through one of those other places, we'll be ready and prepared to respond to what God is doing.